One of me, hey look, I did one of this, and I took the shot over there, but I hid myself behind this thing. I came around here, and I did this dance. Remember the dance Walter Houston did in the Treasure Sierra Madre, the old guy? He said, "Hey man, you got the goal right under your feet," you know. I came around, that's what I did in front of this, and I said to my friends, "Hey, when are you coming up? You know, when are you coming up?" I just finished this baby. It's called The Caretakers. And it took me about 4 or 5 months to do. So, solid rock.
How much does it weigh?
Well, it weighed 7 tons to begin with. And now I think it weighs about 5 tons. So I've eliminated about 2 tons. And I used the stone for the driveway.
So nothing's wasted around here?
Nothing is wasted.
Is there an order for this, or is this just, are you doing this on commission?
No. I just do it for myself. I started out as a painter, but as I went along, these mediums began to come, they just diverted from the main painting stretch, and I began working with lithography and still photography. Films became part of the thing. But I realized that all these mediums are, since they're visual, they all fuse together in my mind, whether it's filmic. You only have to understand the medium and its limitations and what its possibilities are. But the rest is a kind of a visual thought on where this medium can express itself best. So I've gone from carving stone, carving wood, etching, I don't know, you name it. But to me, I've realized that it doesn't matter. It's a kind of cohesion of all these things. And each lends to the other, you know, the other medium. So I find it a very fascinating kind of challenge. So that's why I'm apt to, I don't know what I'm apt to do next, you know, maybe write poetry. made another one like this that sold to some collective friends of mine called the Blums, and it was called The Cabinet of Dr. Gaucher. Comes from a long line of things.
Cabinet of
Dr. Calgary.
Calgary.
When I made this thing, there was one very much like this, and the thing was here, Dr. Paul Gaucher. Paul Gaucher was the guy, the doctor that took care of Vincent van Gogh. So, when you open that cabinet, it was very fascinating. There was a whole bunch of figures like that, but in one corner there was an ear. So, the collectors bought it, you know. So I made this one, calling it the Department of Interior, and I think because I like that kind of presentation. Like all kids, you know, they break away from home, and I ended up in New York studying at the Art Students League. I was always involved in photography in one way or another. They sort of paralleled my art studies. I made my own darkroom, and I remember my first attempt at motion picture work. I traded an old hunting rifle as a youth for a 16 millimeter camera, a Kodak camera. And from then on, of course, I was hooked. I began to look at films in a different light. I began to see the possible connection, the grammar of film. You know, the connecting links between one shot and another, and how you had to sort of structurally make a scene work from one to. I began to be conscious of that at the time, because I had the camera. I was just shooting ad lib and like one does with a camera, just shooting anything around them and everything. And but then you had to put it together and make some sort of sense out of it. This is where my first interest in film began to be apparent, and I just loved the whole thing. It has a kind of illusion of movement. You had to understand what happens to film and how it works, frame by frame, you know, in the camera. When you began to feel that, it began to open up avenues of exploration, creativity, I suppose, you know. I never thought in those years that would ever be possible to go abroad. In those years, they had the old liners, steamship liners that carried passengers across. It was sort of an exotic trip at that time. So Europe was always an attraction, particularly Paris. At that time, Picasso and Matisse, they were the great revolutionaries. And I could never think of, we were in the heart of the Depression, and no one had any money, and I never could dream of such a thing. But the Army opened it up finally when the war came along. I was with the 4th Division, 12th Infantry Regiment, and by that time I'd done a lot of filming in 16 millimeter, particularly my soldier buddies. The regiment saw some of my work, and the colonel decided, hey, we've got to use this guy in the regiment, So they made me a sort of regimental photographer, historian, I don't know what you might call it, and it was a moment that gave me the opportunity to do a lot of filming, combat footage and stuff like that. From D-Day, when I landed, I was filming. I was a rifleman still filming. I landed at Utah, and I remember I had some filmic stuff that I did, and we had a counterattack. And I remember having to bury the film in sand somewhere because it was a precarious moment for us. And the thing was that all identification and that kind of stuff had to be thrown aside. And I remember putting a 100-foot camera reel in a 50-foot reel in the sand somewhere and burying it. I often wondered if that thing is still there. But it had to do with all the events that were taking place, I went from Utah along the coast to take Sherwood, which was about a month after we had landed on D-Day. And they shifted me up to headquarters and became associated with regimental headquarters, and from then on I was with a camera and a sketch pad and that kind of thing. I became an official sort of historian for them. We were in a major battle in Mortain, which was called the Breakthrough at the time. And we went from Mortain, and we started on that road to Paris, the road to liberation, which we had no knowledge of at the time. But eventually we did. We got into and we liberated Paris, which was just a magnificent moment, for us all. Not only historically, but it was just joyous. The city itself was in a state of chaos because the French were taking it as a sort of liberation, but the fighting all over the city, tanks, and we're trying to get the bridges, and people were crowding us as we went in, despite the fact that there was firing, and it was a very treacherous and very dangerous period. But we were stopped in our tracks, literally, in front of the Cathedral of Notre Dame. The people actually got out into the streets and stopped tanks and an army from going any further. And they picked people out of the half-tracks and the vehicles, carried them on their shoulders. And the army was stopped in its tracks right in the middle of Paris. Just incredible. People lived. I recall being very fearful because they just literally picked me out of the half-track. And I was frightened because they were juggling and people crowding me and they were carrying me on their shoulders. And I was thinking, hey, you know, this maybe it's heroic for someone thinking that way, but for me it was going to be dropped or something's going to happen. It was very dramatic. I was filming this stuff with the people throwing flowers and trying to climb the vehicle. But when we actually got to a dead stop, it was no longer possible or feasible to do it. They just grabbed us out of the half tracks and carried us away into the crowds. It almost foretold the end of the war. The end of the war had come, and I went back to the Art Students League, and I remember somehow the vision of wanting to go to Paris, and if I was wondering if there was a possibility of doing it on the GI Bill. And there was no stipulation on the GI Bill that one could ever use that bill in a foreign soil or in a foreign university or something like that. And I began to make inquiries, and I realized it looks like it never could happen because they never made plans for such uses of that bill. And finally, through a series of events, I got to see the Veterans Administration in New York and Washington, and they finally came to the conclusion that if you could get an acceptance from a recognized school, then we have no alternative but to approve of it, and you could go. They called the Beaux-Arts, and they accepted me, and they sent back a letter of acceptance. That's how I got back to Paris. So I went back, but it took maybe 9 months before the first check on the GI Bill came. But I was at the École des Beaux-Arts, which was really wonderful in a way. Well, of course, I met my wife. She was a student. She came out of Helsinki, Finland, and we met as students at the American House in the complex there, the campus of the University of Paris. They had different houses set up for different nationalities. And we met there. And from then on, of course, we just floated all over the place, floated around. I felt since I had studied in Paris, I wanted to go to an art school in Italy and just, my feeling about art was just to get as much as I could of different cultures into my system. Helena got an invitation to go to India to tutor the French ambassador's son to India because she had helped that boy in Finland. When they were in Finland, he was a minister to Helsinki, Finland, and she took care of the kid in the summertime. And the ambassador asked her to go to India. If she would go to India to tutor the boy, and I said to Helena, "Go to India. I'll follow because it's a wonderful opportunity." And that's how we got to India. I returned to America. I was fooling around with film, and I got a letter from a friend of mine who was in films and said, send some of your stuff into New York. They have a Creative Film Foundation at the time, it was called, and they're giving out some awards or something. And I was experimenting with some animation techniques at the time. I had already seen Norman McLaren's films, too. He was the Canadian animator who made great strides in experimental work like that. And I was very fascinated because my film seemed to parallel his, the techniques and things that he was using. So anyway, that started a whole ball rolling, and I picked up some awards. And I got into New York, and the Creative Film Foundation was established there, and they used to have a membership of about 5,000 members, and they used to show these 16mm films, which are called experimental, of course. And I started making short films, and they were all accepted. I won many awards there, and of course it induced me. It was very stimulating. And finally, they needed me to do a film on a piano, an old piano that I had purchased somewhere in Manhattan, and they delivered it to our apartment in Manhattan. And I started working on that thing. It took me maybe 6 months or something to do. Lincoln Center was just in the process of putting its first international film festival. It opened. And I entered Pianissimo, and I was absolutely stunned by the fact that they opened the whole festival with my film. I picked up a nomination. Then I got a Ford Foundation grant, which was an incredible thing, because that was unheard of. Since film is like painting in my mind, how about making a self-portrait? I was thinking, what the hell would you do to make a self-portrait in terms of film? And it struck me that I should be able to do that. But that film turned out to be background, because after 2 or 3 years, I had a lot of footage, and it was getting to be a burden for us, both Helen and I. And I decided this is going too far. This film would go on forever, I could see, because I was delving into my past, but I was delving into trying to express it. So that's how background was born, as a matter of fact. It was born simply because it had to be put together in some kind of form and put out. And that's how I did background. But it was nominated for an Academy Award, which was astounding, you know, in a sense. I got into wood simply, I guess, because it was available. Wood was available in big pieces, and they were part of the property. And eventually, of course, I got into this stone work up here, which I find very, very fascinating, because it takes stone cutting takes a sort of Zen mentality. You know, it takes forever to do. Nice, because it's an illustration of what we're doing. Finally, of course, you get aging to the degree that I said to her, look, when we retire, let's go. It's so wonderful. We love this place. Let's go up there, and we got our Social Security, and we'll settle down. We'll do, you know, I'll do my painting or sculpting, whatever, and you do what you want. So that's how it occurred. So it's been like 12 or 15 years now. I haven't been back to Manhattan. We're lost up here. I think it's a wonderful area. I love it. When I go traveling in the car, I see this landscape, I'm just overwhelmed by it. About 12 years ago, I had seen a little schoolhouse there, and it was not occupied, and I thought it might be a good gallery to put my work in. And since it was on 37, I thought there was enough traffic on the road that it would attract a few people to come in and see the work. So I decided to throw all my creative energies up there in the gallery instead of keeping them in the studio at home. And people did stop, not in great numbers, but there were a lot of interesting people, tourists going up into Canada, Canadians coming through, the Americans as well. had Japanese visitors, I had people from around the world. Art is stimulating and a challenge for one's abilities, one's imagination, one's intellect. It is something that you can confront, and it is a confrontation with yourself that I think so wonderfully stimulating. It's not like working the stock market, you know, and sitting on your butt. I think it's so. But when you're working on things like this, it's very inspiring at times, and very, very difficult, very frustrating too. But I've learned over a lifetime of working like that, that's the way it's got to be, you know. But the quest, I don't know what the quest is for, but it's a quest, I think, for every man, isn't it? To find an answer to something. An expedition into a mystery.